The Cold War wasn't just about politics, it was about survival. For nearly 5 decades, the world was held hostage by an invisible conflict, one that shaped economies, alliances, and even the fate of entire nations. A war with no direct battles, but one that pushed humanity to the brink of annihilation. At the heart of it all stood 2 superpowers: the United States, championing capitalism, democracy, and personal freedoms; the Soviet Union, advocating communism, central planning, and state control over individual lives. This wasn't a traditional war. Instead, their struggle played out in espionage, proxy wars, space exploration, and a relentless arms race that could have ended civilization in an instant. But where did it all begin? To understand the Cold War, we must go back to 1945, when the world emerged from the devastation of World War II, only to find itself on the edge of a new conflict. Origins of the Cold War. In May 1945, the world celebrated the fall of Nazi Germany. The streets of London and New York erupted in joy, and people thought peace had finally arrived. But beneath the surface, a new rivalry was brewing. During the war, the United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side against Hitler. Their alliance, however, was one of necessity rather than trust. Now, with their common enemy defeated, old suspicions resurfaced. With that question arose, why did the US and USSR distrust each other? 1. Opposing ideologies. The US and the USSR had fundamentally different visions for the world. The United States promoted free markets, democracy, and individual liberties. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin believed in state control, communism, and suppressing dissent. Each side saw the other as a threat to its existence. 2. The Soviet Union's expansion in Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi rule, they didn't leave. Instead, Stalin installed pro-communist puppet governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond. The US saw this as aggression. Stalin, however, claimed it was for security to prevent another Western invasion. 3. The US drops the atomic bomb. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. But this wasn't just about ending the war. It was also a message to Stalin. The US had unmatched military power. The Soviets saw it as a direct challenge, and their response was clear. They had to build their own bomb. With this, the seeds of the Cold War had been planted. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences. In early 1945, even before Germany's defeat, the Allied leaders met to decide what the post-war world would look like. The Yalta Conference, February 1945. Germany was to be divided into 4 occupation zones: US, UK, USSR, and France. Stalin promised free elections in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union agreed to join the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. At the time, Roosevelt believed Stalin could be reasoned with, but Churchill remained skeptical. The Potsdam Conference, July 1945. By July, things had changed. Roosevelt had died, replaced by Harry Truman, who was far less trusting of Stalin. At Potsdam, Truman demanded free elections in Eastern Europe, but Stalin refused. The US revealed its atomic bomb to intimidate Stalin. Stalin responded by accelerating Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Tensions were now irreversible. The world was split between East and West. The Iron Curtain descends. In March 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the US and made a speech that would define the Cold War era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. What did Churchill mean? He was describing the division of Europe. Western Europe was rebuilding with US support, while Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet control. Communist governments, loyal to Stalin, took power one by one. The world was no longer united. It was divided between 2 rival camps. The Marshall Plan. By 1947, Europe was on the brink of economic collapse. Cities lay in ruins, industries had shut down, and famine loomed over millions. War-torn nations struggled to rebuild, and desperation was setting in. The United States feared that poverty and chaos would drive European nations toward communism. Soviet-backed communist parties were gaining support in France, Italy, and beyond. something had to be done. Enter the Marshall Plan, a bold initiative to revive Europe's economy and stop the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan's grand vision. In June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive economic aid package for Europe. The United States provided $13 billion in economic aid, equivalent to about $150 billion today, to help rebuild war-torn nations. This funding was used to restore cities, industries, and infrastructure, ensuring a faster recovery. It also supplied food, machinery, and raw materials, helping economies get back on their feet and preventing further instability. Marshall did not discriminate. Even the Soviet Union and its allies were invited to participate, but Stalin refused the offer, seeing it as a capitalist trap. Instead, he forced Eastern European nations to reject the aid. Czechoslovakia, eager to accept, was pressured into declining under Soviet threats. The plan's success and Soviet reaction. The Marshall Plan worked wonders. By the early 1950s, Western Europe's economy was booming, communist influence declined sharply in democratic nations, and the United States gained strong allies in Europe. Seeing the U.S. strengthen Western Europe, Stalin responded with Comecon, an economic alliance for the Eastern Bloc. However, the Soviet economy struggled, unable to match the resources of the Marshall Plan. Meanwhile, tensions in Germany would soon escalate into the first major Cold War crisis, the Berlin Blockade and Airlift. In 1948, the world witnessed the first true confrontation of the Cold War. At the heart of it all was Berlin, a city divided into West Berlin, controlled by the US, UK, and France, and East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet Union. Stalin viewed West Berlin as a capitalist outpost deep inside Soviet territory. To force the West out, he cut off all land and rail access to West Berlin. The crisis. In 1948, 2.5 million residents of West Berlin were left without food, fuel, and medicine after the Soviet Union blocked all land and rail access to the city. Stalin expected the US and its allies to surrender West Berlin, forcing it under Soviet control. But the West refused to give in. Rather than risk open war, the United States launched an unprecedented humanitarian mission, the Berlin Airlift, delivering vital supplies by air for nearly a year, proving their commitment to defending democracy. The Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, the United States and Britain carried out one of the most ambitious airlift operations in history to keep West Berlin alive. Over 11 months, they conducted 200,000 flights, delivering 4,700 tons of food and fuel every day to the blockaded city. At its peak, a plane landed every 3 minutes, ensuring that West Berliners had the essentials to survive despite the Soviet blockade. The operation was a symbol of Western resolve. The Soviets couldn't shoot down the planes without triggering war. By May 1949, Stalin gave up and lifted the blockade. The West had won the first Cold War battle, but the crisis proved one thing: Europe needed military protection. The formation of NATO, the West unites. The Berlin blockade sent a clear message. Stalin was willing to use force to expand Soviet power. To counter future threats, Western nations formed a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Arne, NATO, in April 1949. What is NATO? NATO was a defensive alliance formed by 12 nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and others. It operated on the principle of collective defense. If one member was attacked, all would respond together. To reinforce this commitment, the U.S. stationed troops permanently in Europe, ensuring the security of Western Europe against potential threats. However, while NATO provided stability for its members, it also deepened global divisions, further entrenching the divide between the East and the West. The Soviet response. The Warsaw Pact. Stalin saw NATO as a direct threat. In 1955, he created his own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, uniting Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Now the world was officially divided into two armed camps: NATO, Western Bloc, led by the US, and Warsaw Pact, Eastern Bloc, controlled by the USSR. The Cold War had become a military standoff, and the arms race was about to begin. The arms race begins. The year is 1949. The United States is no longer the sole nuclear power. the Soviet Union has successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, sending shockwaves through the West. This marks the beginning of the arms race, an unprecedented buildup of nuclear weapons between the US and the USSR. The hydrogen bomb, a new nightmare. In 1952, the US detonates the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union tests its own H-bomb in 1953. The world enters a terrifying new era, mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one superpower launches a nuclear strike, the other will retaliate with full force, ensuring total annihilation. The fate of humanity hangs by a thread. ICBMs and the nuclear triad. By the late 1950s, both nations developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of striking targets across the globe within minutes. To maintain dominance, both sides create a nuclear triad: land-based ICBMs, missiles in underground silos, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and strategic bombers armed with nuclear payloads. The world is now armed to the teeth, waiting for a single miscalculation that could end civilization. The Korean War. While the Cold War had been a battle of ideologies, it had not yet turned into full-scale warfare until 1950, when tensions exploded on the Korean peninsula. The invasion, North versus South. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched an invasion of South Korea, a US-supported democracy. Within days, the communist forces overran Seoul, capturing the South Korean capital. In response, the United Nations, led by the United States, swiftly intervened, deploying troops to push back the North Korean advance. This marked the beginning of a brutal conflict that would devastate the Korean peninsula, leading to years of intense fighting and immense human suffering. China enters the war. As US and UN forces push North Korea back, China, fearing an American invasion, sends 300,000 troops into battle. The war descends into a bloody stalemate, with both sides suffering enormous casualties. Armistice, the war that never ends. After 3 years of brutal fighting, the Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice, but no formal peace treaty. The 38th parallel remained the dividing line between North and South Korea, solidifying the peninsula's division. The war claimed over 2.5 million lives, leaving a devastating impact on both sides. To this day, Korea remains divided, standing as a powerful symbol of the Cold War's lingering and unresolved tensions. The Red Scare and McCarthyism. As tensions escalated abroad, fear of communism gripped America itself. The early 1950s saw the rise of McCarthyism, an era of paranoia, accusations, and political purges. The rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin became the face of anti-communist hysteria, claiming that Soviet spies had infiltrated the US government. He led aggressive investigations, accusing politicians, Hollywood actors, and even the military of having communist ties. As a result, hundreds of Americans were blacklisted, losing their jobs and reputations. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAS, intensified the paranoia by interrogating citizens suspected of communist sympathies. Fear spread across the nation as neighbors turned against one another, deepening the climate of suspicion and distrust. The fall of McCarthy. By 1954, McCarthy's reckless accusations backfire. During televised hearings, his tactics are exposed as baseless and cruel. The public turns against him, and he is eventually censured by the Senate. His fall marks the end of the Red Scare, but the fear of communism continues to shape American policy. The space race. While nuclear weapons threatened destruction on Earth, another Cold War front was opening: space. By the late 1950s, the US and the Soviet Union were racing to prove their technological superiority beyond our planet. This battle for cosmic dominance became known as the space race. Sputnik, the shock heard around the world. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It orbited Earth in 98 minutes, emitted radio signals, proving Soviet technology was ahead. Watching this, the US feared the Soviet Union could soon launch nuclear missiles from space. The space age had begun, and the United States scrambled to respond. The moon landing. America takes the lead. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued a bold challenge. We choose to go to the moon. The US invested billions in NASA's Apollo program, leading to a historic moment. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon. The world watched in awe as Armstrong declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Although the US had won the space race, but the Cold War was far from over. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world came closer than ever to nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. When US spy planes discovered them, a 13-day standoff ensued. Kennedy versus Khrushchev, the ultimate test. President John F. Kennedy issued a chilling ultimatum as the US imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, determined to prevent Soviet missile deployment. He warned that failure to remove the missiles could lead to full-scale war, raising tensions to an all-time high. As Soviet ships approached the blockade, the world held its breath, teetering on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. A deal in the shadows. On October 28, 1962, a secret deal was reached. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. The US secretly pledged to remove its missiles from Turkey, and the nuclear war was narrowly avoided, but tensions remained high. This crisis marked the closest the world had ever come to nuclear Armageddon and reinforced the urgency of diplomatic negotiations. The Vietnam War, the Cold War's bloodiest conflict. While the world watched the superpowers face off over nuclear weapons, another brutal Cold War conflict was raging, the Vietnam War. A nation divided, North versus South Vietnam. Vietnam had been split. North Vietnam, communist, supported by the USSR and China. South Vietnam, anti-communist, backed by the US. In 1964, the US escalated its involvement after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where American ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces. The escalation, the US enters the war. The United States deployed over 500,000 troops to Vietnam, confident that it could prevent the spread of communism. However, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong relied on guerrilla tactics, making the war difficult to win. In 1968, the Tet Offensive stunned the American public, revealing that victory was far from certain. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly unpopular in the United States, fueling protests and calls for withdrawal. The fall of Saigon. The U.S. withdraws. By 1973, the U.S. withdrew its forces. In 1975, Saigon fell to the communists, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The war was a major Cold War failure for the U.S., proving that military power alone could not stop communism. The Soviet-Afghan War. By 1979, the Cold War had reached its final battlefield, Afghanistan. The Soviet Union, fearing the loss of a communist ally, launched a full-scale invasion to prop up the pro-Soviet government in Kabul. But what seemed like an easy intervention turned into a decade-long quagmire. A Soviet Vietnam. The U.S. saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as an opportunity to weaken its rival and launched Operation Cyclone, a covert CIA program that secretly armed and funded the Afghan Mujahideen fighters. Trained by the US and Pakistan, the Mujahideen waged relentless guerrilla warfare, using Afghanistan's treacherous terrain to their advantage. Equipped with Stinger missiles, they successfully shot down Soviet helicopters, dealing devastating blows to the Soviet forces. Facing fierce resistance and mounting losses, the Soviets suffered over 15,000 casualties, making the war a costly and demoralizing conflict for the USSR. The war drained Soviet resources, further weakening the communist empire. Soviet withdrawal and defeat. By 1989, the Soviet Union, unable to achieve victory, was forced to withdraw. The war hastened the collapse of the USSR, marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe. By the late 1980s, cracks were forming in the Soviet bloc as economic stagnation and political corruption fueled widespread discontent. In an attempt to reform the system, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring. But these changes only accelerated demands for democracy across Eastern Europe. One by one, communist regimes began to collapse. In Poland, 1989, the first free elections marked the end of communist rule. Hungary, 1989, opened its borders, allowing East Germans to escape to the West. In Czechoslovakia, 1989, the peaceful Velvet Revolution led to the country's transition to democracy. As these uprisings spread, the once powerful Iron Curtain was rapidly falling, signaling the approaching end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. On November 9, 1989, the world watched history unfold. For decades, the Berlin Wall stood as the most powerful symbol of the Cold War divide. However, as protests swept across Eastern Europe and nations reclaimed their freedom, East Germany could no longer hold back the tide of change. In a historic announcement, East German officials declared that citizens were free to cross the border. Thousands of Berliners seized the moment, flooding the wall and dismantling it piece by piece. The Cold War's most visible barrier had fallen. Just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, bringing an end to an era of global tension. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. By 1991, the once mighty Soviet Union was falling apart. Economic crises crippled the nation. Republics like Lithuania, Ukraine, and Russia declared independence, and a failed coup attempt in August 1991 sealed the USSR's fate. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War reshaped the modern world in profound ways. NATO expanded, welcoming former Eastern Bloc countries that once stood under Soviet influence. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, while Russia, the successor to the USSR, faced years of economic and political turmoil. The intense nuclear arms race left a lasting impact on global security policies, shaping military strategies and international diplomacy. Though the Cold War officially ended, its legacy continues to influence global affairs, alliances, and geopolitical tensions to this day. The Cold War defined an era of fear, competition, and resilience, a struggle of ideologies that also showcased human perseverance. It served as a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked rivalry. At the same time, it underscored the value of diplomacy over conflict and the importance of global cooperation in maintaining peace. Though the Cold War has ended, divisions in the world persist in new forms. How we move forward depends on the lessons we choose to remember and the actions we take to prevent history from repeating itself. What are your thoughts on the Cold War? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more fascinating history videos. If you're interested in exploring more about history, check out the links in the description below. I've included some carefully selected books, historical collectibles, and fascinating memorabilia that you might enjoy. Every purchase through these links helps support the channel at no extra cost to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.